And this is part 4 of the ENDER 3 extruder upgrade series, final assembly and installation on the printer. Make sure you click subscribe and ring the bell to get notified of the next great project coming up. Unfortunately, due to the length of this video, I did have to split it into 2 separate parts. Let's jump into part B, finishing final assembly and installation on the printer. It centers the spring when it's clamping on, so we can just catch those threads. And again, we install the second one on the other side. So let me get the printer up on the bench and we can install this on the printer. Okay, so we got the printer up here now, and this is the old extruder that came off. You can see some of the grease there, and again, like I said, these cheap bearings, after a while they will leak a little grease, and you're gonna have to swap them out. So but this extruder has probably been on in printing for 6 months, and you can see here's the 2 gears that were on it. They're still in great condition, so could do a quick bearing change out on those guys and they'd be good to go. So here's the new gear that we printed, and this requires an M3 nut. It's the same insert, and I started it already. We just need to push it in and make sure it lines up. Alright, perfect. And then so obviously I don't have the original extruder on here, but you would remove these 4 screws that hold the motor in. Obviously disconnect the wire on the motor. The motor should drop off and the stock extruder here should come out. You remove the push fit tube and separate the PTFE tube from that, and you need to loosen the screw and take off the supplied gear. Now on the newer printers, this gear sometimes is press fit instead of retained by a screw. I've gotten those off sometimes, you know, with like 2 screwdrivers prying on either side, and I've on a Monoprice Mini that had that type of press fit gear, plastic gear, I've gotten it off. You may have to use heat. If you do use heat, you have to be really careful. You don't want to get these motors too hot, because the heat will travel down the shaft and ruin the inside. So last resort if you have to use heat to pry that off. Alright, so in the original configuration, you want to take a standard, what this is like a 3mm by 12 or 15, and you want to put one of these in this corner here closest to the screw, and that will hold the stepper motor in place while the other 3 screws will be used to affix the Greg Wade's extruder. Okay, so you need to insert the gear on the shaft, and again, the shaft has a, if you can see it here, it has a flat spot right where the screw is, so you need to make sure you line that up correctly and insert the shaft. If you get it on straight, you should be able to press it down. Alright, so if the gear is really tight, it's easier to do it by taking the stepper off completely, and you also need to make sure when you're pushing it on down that you're pushing it straight. If you kind of get it cocked in there on an angle, you might get like a burr or a shaving in there that you'll have to clean up with a file or pick or something along those lines. Also, when you get down to flush with the shaft, I used one of the old bearings, and you can stick it on here and then kind of push down on it with your hand to get it down as far as you need. Now, this extruder, I made everything really tight, so when the gear is in there, when I measured it out, I only used one washer. You probably want to use 2 washers just to get a little extra clearance there. I mean, it's really tight. But what you need to do is you need to get this gear aligned with the larger gear. So it sits on here like this. These 3 holes, 1, 2, 3, screw into these 3 points on the extruder, and it's slotted so it gives you the ability to adjust in and out the clearance. So if the clearance is, if there's too much of a gap between the two, you're going to get slop in your gear. So you want to try and get it as tight as you can, and that way you don't really get any slop in the gear. So the easiest thing to do here is kind of dry fit it. Once you have everything in position, you can line it up, and you want to make sure that the teeth align. As you can see, the teeth are on an angle. They kind of look like arrows, and the arrows link into each other. So you need to make sure that the depth of this gear is correct. If it's offset like that, it's not going to dig. It's not going to sit well in the teeth. So they really need to be pretty much flush together, and that's the correct depth. So that depth is adjusted by the location of the smaller gear. Now you can't really shim this one out because you've cut hobbed serrating on this bolt here, so if you shifted this out, it's going to throw off the gear. So like worst case scenario, if you had to shift that out a lot, you could cut the hobbed teeth in here again, and I've done that before. Like if I didn't have another bolt and I really messed up the alignment, you can cut a second groove in there as long as it's not too close to the original one. So let's get this mounted up. Now you want to make sure that you mount the extruder in correctly. The connections need to be facing the right side. You need to put the set screw in to hold the small gear on, and when you take off the old extruder, you're going to find this one screw, and you can see here that it's has a tapered head on. So it's the only screw that gives you enough clearance when it's spinning not to hit right here on the extruder. So just make sure you run it in all the way and tighten it up. Okay, so after I tightened the lock nut down on the gear, my hobbing was off just a little bit, and I'll have a link to the Thingiverse for this, but I designed a couple spacers, and when I printed out my last gear I had 2 or 3 different widths, and these are printed in ABS. And basically, if once you tighten everything down, if your hobbing's off just a little bit, you can use one of these spacers to kind of take up the slack. So I have one of the thinner ones here. I'm going to throw that on and see how it looks once I tighten down the nut again. So alright, so I tightened it down. I did end up using the thinnest shim spacer. I don't know if you can see it, it's black, but it's in there. And once I tightened it down, it looks like the gear lined up pretty good. So right where I needed it to be. Now when you're tightening this down, it's a nylock, so it's not going to loosen up. You don't want to over tighten it. It spins freely, and we can see that the washer is spinning, the inner sleeve of the bearing is spinning, so it's tight enough that it's putting pressure on the inner part of the bearing, and the bearing itself is actually spinning. The bolt isn't on here loose and slipping. So as long as it's tight enough to make the bearings spin correctly, you don't have to over tighten it by any means. So now we can set this back in and check our height dimensions on the gear. So alright, so now we can see it's not flush. The bigger gear is actually higher up right here, and when we spin it we can kind of hear it making some noise, and it's not seating right. So because we raised this up a little, now we need to adjust this gear, small gear, and raise it up a little bit too. So alright, that looks better. Alright, so make sure everything's tight and there's no slack in the gear, and let's tighten these guys up. Alright, that looks good, and we can tighten up the lock nut on the small gear. Okay, we just need to install the PTFE tube, and should click right in. So we just need to add the tensioning bolts, and this is the standard 2-inch number 6 screw bolt, and then we have a washer and the standard bed spring, and then this 3D printed spring cup that I'll link in the description. And so we have 2 complete sets, and they should just screw in. So basically we don't want it too tight, but if it's too loose then you'll start skipping, or the feeds will skip a little. So if If you have some issues with it skipping on the filament or any type of grinding, obviously it's a little too loose, you need to tighten it up. And you need to make sure that you plug in the stepper motor again. And the last thing that you need to do is to reset your E-steps. You know, now that this extruder is going to be running at a 3-to-1 ratio, your E-steps are going to increase greatly. So I'll put a pop-up here with the, you know, a generic estimated number to use for the 3-to-1 ratio, and set that up to begin with. And then you need to run an E-step calibration and do the math to make the adjustment to whatever your extruder calibrates to. And that's going to differ from extruder to extruder. It all depends on how tight the tensioning is back here and how coarse the hobbing is on the hob bolt that you created. So let me do a quick E-step calibration, and then we can run a test print and see how it goes. This print is a custom sliced Marvin print that I made for testing out quick prints, and basically it is half vase mode and half normal standard G-code layer printing. So it prints the beginning of the Marvin as a single layer in vase mode, and then when it gets to the top at the crown of the head, it switches over to an infill based standard print.